She posted an Instagram reel captioned, "Never let anyone hold back your potential sparkles," right after leaving me for a wealthier guy she met online. I didn't respond or defend myself. Months later, she deleted every picture with him after his fraud investigation went viral and my company started trending for completely different reasons. I think we've just been growing in different directions. That was it. No fight. No warning. No conversation that built up to it over days or weeks. Just Ophelia, standing near the kitchen counter with her ceramic coffee mug, saying those 7 words like she was reading them off a grocery list. Calm. Prepared. Rehearsed. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her. This woman I'd spent 3 years building a life with, and felt something shift in my chest. Not shattering. Not the kind of thing you see in movies where someone collapses against a wall. Something quieter than that. Like a door closing in a house you didn't realize you were still living in. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. She looked at the countertop. At her coffee. At the small succulent in the terracotta pot on the windowsill we'd bought together at a Brooklyn street market 2 summers ago. Anywhere but at me. And that part, that very specific inability to hold my gaze, told me everything the words were carefully leaving out. I didn't know it yet. But that quiet Tuesday morning in our shared apartment near Prospect Park was the starting point of a sequence of events I could not have predicted, scripted, or designed if I'd spent a year trying. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 28. She was 26. 3 years together, 2 of them in that apartment in Brooklyn. I was running a small tech consulting firm I'd bootstrapped out of nothing, starting from a co-working desk in Dumbo, building it client by client, contract by contract. Nothing flashy. Nothing trending on LinkedIn. Nothing that would impress someone at a rooftop party in Tribeca if you described it too briefly. Just solid work, a growing client list, and a reputation I'd earned slowly in the unglamorous, methodical way that real things tend to get built. Ophelia worked in brand partnerships at a mid-size media company in Midtown. She was genuinely talented at her job. She had an eye for aesthetics, a natural ability to read a room, and a very precise internal radar for knowing whose orbit was worth entering and whose wasn't. That radar had been pointed at me for 3 years. At some point, I'm still not entirely sure exactly when, it quietly recalibrated. I want to be honest about the weeks before the breakup, because the ending didn't come out of nowhere. There were signs. I noticed them, and then, one by one, I talked myself out of taking them seriously. That's the part I'm less proud of. Not that she left, but that I watched the warning signals arrive and chose the optimistic interpretation every single time, like some kind of emotional optimism bias I couldn't override. She started mentioning a name. Valerian. The first time, it was packaged as a professional reference, clean and plausible. He's in the fintech space, runs some kind of crypto investment platform, super connected in the Tribeca scene, knows everyone. I didn't think much of it. New York was full of people like that, or at least people who presented themselves convincingly as people like that. The second time, the context was different. Lighter. More personal, somehow. Valerian was at that rooftop thing in Tribeca on Friday. She said it like she was mentioning the weather. I asked if she'd gone. She said she stopped by for a bit. She said it in that specific way people say things when they've already decided the answer doesn't require further detail and they're daring you, just slightly, to ask for it anyway. I didn't ask. Looking back, that was probably the moment I should have asked. But I didn't. The third time his name came up, it was woven into a conversation about ambition and timelines. We'd been having one of those late-night kitchen conversations that feel important while they're happening, about what the next few years were supposed to look like, about what we each wanted. I talked about the business, about what I was building and where I thought it was going. She listened in that way where the body language doesn't quite match the nodding, where you can tell someone is performing engagement while their actual attention is somewhere else entirely. And then she said something about how some people build things that scale quickly, and some people build things that take a long time to become visible. And then she said Valerian was someone who understood how to move fast. I heard the comparison. I felt it, even. I just didn't want to follow it to its logical destination. So I steered the conversation somewhere else. And we went to bed. And I told myself I was imagining it. There is a specific sensation that arrives before the end of something significant. I describe it less as a feeling and more as a shift in atmospheric pressure. Nothing obviously wrong. Nothing you can point to in a single isolated moment. Just the air in the room getting slightly harder to breathe without you being able to explain why. She started coming home later on weeknights. She started booking things, events, dinners, rooftop parties, without mentioning them until the day of, if at all. She booked a long weekend in Miami. Solo, she said. Just needed some space and sun. She came back with new sunglasses, a deep tan, and a lightness about her that I hadn't seen in months. She came back looking like someone who'd made a decision. She also came back smiling at her phone in a way that I can only describe as directed. Not a scroll, not a meme someone sent. A specific, personal, warm kind of smile at a specific, personal, incoming message. That smile is the thing nobody writes about in the breakup postmortems. It's never the big, obvious, undeniable sign that people describe in retrospect. It's the smile at the phone. The one that used to happen because of you. The one that very clearly, very quietly, stopped being about you weeks before anything was said out loud. I noticed it. And I said nothing. I picked up my book. I went to sleep. I carried that knowledge around for days like an object I didn't know what to do with. So when she said, growing in different directions, that Tuesday morning, I wasn't blindsided in the cinematic way people imagine. I was blindsided in a different, quieter way. I was blindsided by how simple the actual reason was once you stripped away all the thoughtful, growth-oriented language around it. She had met someone with a penthouse. I had a good apartment. She had met someone who talked about 8-figure exits like he was ordering off a menu. Offhand, certain, already past the interesting part. I talked about quarterly projections with measured, honest uncertainty. She had met someone who posted content from chartered yachts and called it building a life. I was building an actual company. The gap between those two things, between performing wealth and building something, is only ever visible from the inside. From the outside, especially from the outside of a Tribeca rooftop with a glass of champagne and a skyline view behind you, the performative version is almost always more immediately compelling. The real version looks slower, less photogenic, more like work. And Ophelia had always had a very strong preference for immediately compelling. I moved my things out over a weekend. There wasn't a dramatic conversation. There wasn't a scene. We divided the practical questions, lease, furniture, the things we'd accumulated together, with the kind of practice neutrality that comes from two people who've already processed the hard part privately and are now just executing logistics. Merrick came and helped me without being asked. He showed up Saturday morning with a rented van, 2 breakfast sandwiches wrapped in foil, and the particular energy of someone who was quietly furious on my behalf but had decided not to say so unless I made space for it. He knew me well enough to know I wasn't making space for it. So he just carried boxes. "You doing okay?" he asked once, midway through the second hour, when we were hauling the last of the bookshelf down the stairwell. "Yeah," I said. He nodded. He didn't follow up. That was exactly the right call. I found a sublet in Williamsburg through a connection situation. A 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a walk-up with high ceilings, old radiators that clanked at 2 in the morning, and a view of a water tower and a slim diagonal slice of the Manhattan skyline if you pressed yourself into the right corner of the window and looked at a specific angle. Smaller than what we'd shared, but quiet in a way I didn't fully know I needed until I had it for a few days. I want to tell you I moved in and immediately found my rhythm again. That the clarity of the decision, even if it wasn't my decision, gave me some clean forward momentum. That first week was cleaner than expected, honestly. There's something about the immediate aftermath of a significant loss that produces a strange, almost chemical focus. The shock of absence can clarify, at least briefly. But by the second week, the evenings got longer in the bad way. There were nights, more of them than I'd admit to most people, where I sat at the desk I'd set up in the corner of the living room and couldn't make my brain cooperate for more than 20-minute stretches, where I'd open a proposal document and stare at the cursor for a while before anything came, where the silence of the apartment felt less like peace and more like the particular absence of a sound you'd gotten so accustomed to that you only notice it as a sound after it stops. I let myself have those evenings. Not many, maybe a week and a half's worth. And then I went back to work, not because I was healed, not because I processed it all cleanly, but because the work existed and it needed doing, and I'd learned, somewhere along the way, that the work has a way of taking up the space that grief would otherwise occupy. Not replacing it, just filling the hours with something that has a purpose. 3 weeks after I moved out, I was in a coffee shop on Bedford Avenue on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The light outside was that specific flat gray New York gets in the fall, not quite cold enough for a heavy coat. The city in that transitional state where everyone is slightly wrongly dressed and no one talks about it. I was deep in a spreadsheet. Cost projections for a potential new engagement. I'd been focused for 2 hours and my mind was genuinely on the numbers. My phone buzzed on the table. A DM from Celestine. We've been part of the same Brooklyn social circle for years. Not close exactly, but the kind of person you trust because you've watched how they behave when things are complicated and they've always behaved with real care. Her message said, I wasn't sure if you'd want to see this, but I thought you should. Attached was a screenshot. An Instagram reel. Ophelia's account. I recognized the username before I even registered what I was looking at. The video was shot from a low angle looking up, that very studied aesthetic framing that makes everything feel slightly more expansive than it is. She was in frame from mid-torso up. Golden hour light flooding through tall windows. A marble countertop visible to one side. A glass of something sparkling. The room behind her, visible for just a second as the shot drifted, was large and clean and expensive in that effortless way that actually expensive spaces tend to be. The location tag said, Tribeca, New York. And the caption, never let anyone hold back your potential sparkles. I put the phone face down on the table. I picked up my coffee. Took a sip. The coffee was good. I noticed that. I focused on that detail for a full second. I did not comment on the reel. I did not text her. I did not DM her. I did not call Merrick in that moment. I did not write a single word anywhere. I just sat with the specific, deliberate precision of that caption, with everything it was constructed to communicate and everything it was constructed to obscure, and I let it be what it was. She hadn't used my name. She didn't need to. Anyone in that social circle who knew our story would understand the subtext perfectly. I was the person who had held back her potential. That was the official narrative now. She'd written it, posted it from the penthouse with a sparkling glass and frame, and the story was sealed. Merrick called that night. He'd seen it. He led with, tell me you're not just going to sit on this. I'm going to sit on this, I said. Silence. She is essentially putting your name on a public sign without putting your name on a public sign, he said. I know. People know who she means. I know. And your plan is just nothing? Radio silence. My plan, I said, is to go back to the pitch meeting prep I was working on before you called. A longer silence. The kind where I could hear him actively deciding how to respond. I have words for her, he said finally. Several words, in a specific order. Save them, I said. He exhaled, the long, reluctant exhale of someone who disagrees with a decision but respects the person making it. This is extremely mature and I genuinely hate it, he said. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in about 4 days. I'll call you tomorrow, I said. The pitch meeting was the following Thursday. A mid-sized logistics company out of Queens, family-owned operation that had grown faster than their infrastructure could keep pace with, had been in preliminary conversations with us for several weeks. They needed a comprehensive systems overhaul, better data architecture across 3 warehouses, more efficient routing coordination between their fleet and their fulfillment operations, cleaner, faster communication between the warehouse management system and the delivery tracking layer. It was exactly the kind of problem our team was built to solve. It was also the largest contract we'd ever pursued. The kind of deal that, a year earlier, I would have called aspirational but not yet realistic. The kind that could fundamentally change what category we occupied. I spent the days between Ophelia's reel and that Thursday building the pitch. And here is the honest, simple truth of that period. Every hour I spent on the proposal was an hour I wasn't thinking about the caption. Every conversation with Lockwood about the technical slides was a conversation that existed entirely in the real world, in the domain of actual problems and actual solutions, and not in whatever constructed narrative was playing out on someone's social media grid. The work was the antidote, not as some metaphorical concept, literally, as a mechanical, hour-by-hour replacement for the mental space that resentment would have otherwise filled. Lockwood had been with me since near the beginning. He joined when we were 2 people working out of a shared hot desk in Dumbo, with more conviction than resources. He was methodical and precise in a way that made the work better consistently and quietly. We ran the pitch twice in the 2 days before Thursday. The first run had rough edges, a section in the middle where the logic jumped without enough scaffolding. We reworked it. The second run was clean, tight, the kind of presentation that can be read in 30 seconds and remembered for 30 days. Thursday came. I drove out to Long Island City in the early afternoon, walked into a conference room on the 7th floor of a building overlooking the Queens skyline and shook hands with 5 people who were paying careful, evaluative attention. 2 hours of conversation. I walked them through their own problem before I talked about our solution. That's always the move. Show people you've understood what they're living with before you tell them what you do about it. I was specific about what we deliver and honest about the timeline and honest about the places where the complexity was real and couldn't be smoothed over. I didn't oversell. I didn't use language designed to sound impressive rather than accurate. I just talked about the work the way I talked about the work. 2 hours after I sat down, I walked out with a signed letter of intent. I got to the car, sat in the driver's seat, looked at the steering wheel for a moment. Not in a dramatic way, just a pause. The kind of moment that doesn't feel significant until later, when you understand that it was one of the specific points where the trajectory shifted. I texted Merrick, "Got it." He replied 22 minutes later with a string of all caps, "I'll spare you," and then called 3 minutes after that. "Walk me through it," he said. I did. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he said, "That's the one that changes the shape of everything." "Yeah," I said. "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "Focused," I said. "Like the work pointed somewhere, and now I can see the destination." "It always pointed somewhere," he said. "You just needed the destination to come into range." The contract entered execution. Deliverables, timelines, structured check-ins. The full scaffolding of a project large enough to require real management overhead. I brought on a third contractor full-time that month. I started actively looking at permanent office space in Dumbo. The co-working arrangement that had been the whole world for 2 years had become too small for what we were. There's a specific, quiet strangeness about that realization. When the space that contained your entire aspiration becomes a space you've outgrown. It doesn't feel triumphant in the moment. It just presents itself as a logistical problem to solve. You find a bigger space. You sign a lease. You show up Monday morning, and the work is the same work, just in a room with better natural light and room for the whole team at one table. I heard about Valerian in scattered fragments over the following months. The way you hear about someone who exists at the periphery of your extended social world, but not in your actual life. Context-free pieces arriving when your mind is somewhere else. Celestine mentioned once, sometime around November, that Ophelia had officially moved into his Tribeca place, the penthouse. She reported it like a news item, watching carefully for my reaction. I said, "Okay." She seemed genuinely surprised I had nothing more to add. I genuinely had nothing more to add. A few weeks after that, Merrick mentioned through his own professional network, which was wide and well-connected across architecture, real estate development, and the adjacent social world those industries generate, that Valerian had been hosting major launch events for what he was positioning as a next-generation decentralized investment platform. The kind of events with curated guest lists and open bars and very slick materials. The kind of platform where the projected returns sound extraordinary and the underlying mechanics somehow never quite get explained in concrete, specific language when you ask follow-up questions. Merrick mentioned it carefully, the way someone does when they have a feeling but not evidence. "I don't have anything definitive," he said, "but some of it has a smell." I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind. Didn't consciously return to it. Kept working. The logistics contract completed in January. On time. Under budget on 2 of the 3 major work streams. The client lead, a sharp, direct woman who had initially been the most skeptical person in that first meeting, sent me an email the day we hit the final milestone. She wrote that in 5 years of working with outside consultants, she hadn't encountered a team that delivered with this level of clarity and follow-through. She wrote that she was personally reaching out to 2 companies she knew in adjacent sectors. I read that email standing at my kitchen counter in the new apartment. I'd moved again by then, out of the Williamsburg sublet and into a proper 1-bedroom 2 blocks from the office in Dumbo. I read it 3 times. Not because I needed to absorb the words. Because I wanted to remember exactly what that feeling was. The specific combination of relief and confirmation and the quiet, private pride of having built something that held when it was tested. A 4th person joined the team in February. Alaric, who came from a significantly larger firm where he'd spent 5 years managing complex multi-phase projects. He was structured in a way that made the whole operation sharper almost immediately. The kind of person who tracks the interdependencies, asks the one clarifying question no one else thought to ask, and flags the downstream risk before it becomes a problem. With Alaric managing project operations, I could spend more time on business development and on the larger questions about where the company was going. 2 more contracts closed in February and March. Not the scale of the logistics engagement, but serious work from serious clients. The pipeline looked different than it ever had before. The conversations happening in it were happening at a level that wouldn't have been possible a year earlier. Spring arrived, and with it, something I hadn't been expecting. I wasn't tracking Ophelia. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the shape of what happened. I wasn't monitoring her social media. I had genuinely moved on in the only version that actually works. Not the performed moving on of posting your best life at strategic intervals, but the real, unglamorous version where you're simply too absorbed in what you're doing to have energy left for looking backward. That's the version that doesn't make a good caption, but it's the only one that actually sticks. News about Valerian arrived the way peripheral news always does, without you looking for it, carried by people who thought you'd want to know. A writer from a business publication had reached out in early April through a mutual connection. He was working on a feature about boutique infrastructure consultancies and how they were disrupting the mid-market logistics sector. He'd found our name through one of our client referrals. He wanted 45 minutes on video call. I gave him 45 minutes on a Wednesday morning. I talked about the work honestly, what problems we solved, how we approached them differently from the big players, why the mid-market logistics space had been structurally underserved, and what we'd been doing to take advantage of that gap. I didn't strategize about narrative. I didn't think about how the story would frame us. I just answered his questions the way I'd answer a client's questions, specifically, honestly, without filling empty space with language designed to impress rather than inform. He said he'd send a heads up before it published. I thanked him and went back to the proposal I'd been working on before the call. Then one Thursday afternoon in late April, Lockwood knocked on my office door. He had his phone in his hand. He had the specific expression he gets when something has happened that he's uncertain how to frame. A slight pause in his usually forward-moving effect, a deliberateness in the way he held the device out toward me. "You need to read this," he said. He put the phone on my desk, screen facing up. It was a business news article. The headline was specific and unambiguous and left nothing between the lines. A New York-based fintech founder was under federal investigation for operating what authorities were describing as a fraudulent investment platform. The allegations were detailed. Promises of algorithmic returns built on no actual underlying assets. A convincingly designed interface and a polished pitch deck concealing an operation that was, according to investigators, a classically structured scheme. Money from new investors being used to pay earlier ones, with the founder taking a significant cut and using the rest to maintain the lifestyle that made the whole thing look credible. The name at the center of the investigation. Valerian. I read it twice. All the way through, both times. The scale was larger than I would have guessed. Hundreds of investors across several states. Millions of dollars. A platform that had been presented at legitimate industry events, mentioned in startup media, and apparently passed enough surface-level scrutiny that people with real capital had invested real capital. I set the phone down. Lockwood was standing in the doorway, watching me. "I didn't know it had gotten to this," he said quietly. "Neither did I said. We were quiet for a moment. The city outside the window did its constant, indifferent thing. "Are you okay?" he asked. I held that question for a second. Am I okay? I was okay. What I felt wasn't satisfaction exactly. Not the clean, punchy kind of satisfaction you feel when something simply goes right. What I felt was closer to the particular, quiet release of a long-held breath. Like something that had been waiting for resolution had simply taken its own time arriving at it. Like the version of reality I'd been quietly, privately certain about had finally made itself legible to everyone else. "Yeah," I said. "Let's get back to the Henderson proposal." And we did. By the following morning, the story had significant momentum. Financial Twitter had picked it up and was doing what that community does: forensic analysis, screenshot archives, mapping the network of people who had promoted the platform or appeared in its orbit. Business aggregators were running it. A fraud-focused podcast had turned around a rapid episode. The coverage was wide and detailed and showed no signs of stopping. And attached to the story, in the comment threads, in the circulating screenshots, in the collateral archaeology that surfaces when something goes properly viral, was Ophelia. Not implicated, not accused of anything, but visible. Photos from his social media that had been shared and liked and archived were now being viewed as documentation of a fraud operation's social scaffolding. The events she'd attended, the life she'd appeared in, the aesthetic chapter she'd documented carefully from the inside of that Tribeca penthouse. The reels, the location tags, the golden hour glimpses, was now context for someone else's unraveling. The marble countertop and the golden hour light and the glass of something sparkling and the caption that had communicated, with deliberate precision, that she had left someone behind in order to reach her potential. Gone. Like it had never been posted. I set my phone down. I made coffee. I stood at the window in my Dumbo apartment and looked at the morning light on the bridge and thought, not for the first time, about that Tuesday morning in Brooklyn. The kitchen counter. The ceramic mug. I think we've just been growing in different directions. The careful absence of eye contact. The rehearsed calm. And then the caption, weeks later. Never let anyone hold back your potential. From a penthouse built on fabrications. I thought about what it costs to build a story like that. Not financially. Narratively. You have to decide, with some conviction, that someone else was your limitation. You have to frame your own choice as an escape rather than a trait. You have to construct a version of the past, publicly, on a platform where people are watching, in which you were being held back, and in which leaving was the brave, potential-honoring act. And then you have to live in the story. And when the thing you traded the original story for turns out to be a federally investigated fiction, the narrative collapses inward. And you delete the evidence. And hope the gap in the timeline is less noticeable than it obviously is. I want to say something carefully here because I think it's easy to misread what I'm describing. I'm not saying I was glad this happened to her. I don't think she deserved to be associated, even tangentially and non-legally, with someone under federal investigation. That's not something I'd engineer for anyone. What I'm saying is that the story she told, the one with me as the ceiling and him as the elevation, was never actually about growth. It was about aesthetics. It was about the feeling of upward movement rather than the substance of it. She had traded something real for something that looked extraordinary. And the extraordinary thing turned out to be what extraordinary things that can't withstand specific questions usually turn out to be. I didn't engineer that. I didn't need to. I just didn't stop building. The article came out on a Tuesday in early May. The writer had sent a heads up the Friday before. It was a full feature, 3,000 words. Our company, our approach, the clients, the methodology, the growth curve. The writer had done his homework and framed it well. Not breathless or hagiographic. Just specific, grounded, credible in the way that journalism is when the writer is genuinely interested in the subject and lets the facts carry the story. By Thursday, it had been shared across 3 major LinkedIn newsletters, 2 industry-focused Twitter accounts with substantial followings, and a logistics tech Substack with a subscriber list in the 6 figures. My inbox became something I needed to manage in dedicated blocks of time. New leads, press inquiries, a conference speaking request, reconnections from people I'd met years ago at networking events who were circling back now that we appeared on their radar differently. It was a lot of information coming in quickly. I processed it methodically, one response at a time. Merrick called Thursday evening. Your company name is trending, he said. I know. How does it feel? I thought about it. Like the work became audible, I said. Like it was always playing, but now the volume went up. That's a good way to put it, he said. I've had time to develop the metaphors, I said. He laughed. Ophelia texted me 11 days after the article published. I know the timing because I'd just come out of a long call with a prospective new client, and I looked at my phone and there it was, sitting at the top of my messages without warning. Hey, saw the piece about your company. Congrats. Really proud of what you've built. I read it 3 times. Not because it was complicated. It wasn't complicated at all. It was the message of someone who had staked their public identity on a particular story, a story in which she had made the smart, potential-maximizing, forward-looking choice, and watched that story and the man at the center of it come apart simultaneously. It was the message of someone who needed, even slightly, for there to be a version where she had always been supportive, where she could retroactively position herself as a quiet believer, where the leaving had been about some genuine incompatibility rather than what it was actually about. I understood what it was. I felt no anger at it. I felt something closer to the recognition of a familiar pattern, one that arrives when a narrative someone constructed about you is no longer serving the purpose it was built to serve. I set my phone on the desk. I went back to the proposal I'd been working on. I never replied. People ask me about the silence. When they hear this story, and enough mutual connections know enough pieces of it that it has become, in certain circles, a story people know, they focus on the not responding. Wasn't it hard to not say anything when she posted that reel? When your company started trending, didn't you want her to know that you knew? Didn't you want to say anything to anyone? And the honest answer is yes. There were moments. Specific evenings in the Williamsburg sublet, when the clarity of knowing what that caption meant, and knowing that people who knew us were reading it exactly as it was intended, sat in my chest like something I needed to put down somewhere. There were moments where I drafted, in my head, the perfectly calibrated response. The thing that would communicate, without excess, exactly what I thought about being framed as someone's limitation while I was in a sublet running pitch decks for the biggest contract of my career. I drafted it. I never sent it. Not because I was admirably restrained, but because I'd been in enough rooms, client rooms, negotiating rooms, the rooms where things actually get decided, to understand something fundamental about how attention and credibility work. The person who needs to make the loudest argument for their own value is almost never the one whose value ends up being recognized. The person who posts the most pointed response to being underestimated is almost never the one whose trajectory ultimately makes the best argument. If my work was real, it would eventually get loud enough to speak past any caption. And if it wasn't real, if I was actually wrong about what I was building and she had been right to read it as a dead end, then no clever response was going to change that either. So I stayed quiet, and I worked, and the work accumulated. And eventually the work said everything that needed saying, in a register that captions can't reach. Lockwood and I had lunch in early June at a place near the office we'd been going to regularly since the Dumbo move. Good sandwiches, strong coffee, the kind of neighborhood spot that becomes a ritual without you consciously deciding it will. He'd been with me since the beginning. The two-desk co-working days, the near-miss contracts, the weeks when the math was genuinely tight and neither of us said it out loud. He looked at me over his food at some point and said, "Can I say something honest?" I said yes. He said, 18 months ago, I was genuinely unsure we were going to make it to year 3. I nodded. I want to say I always believed, he said, but that wouldn't be fully true. I know, I said. What I did believe, he said, was that the work was real. Whatever happened with the money side, whatever happened with the business questions, the work itself was real. And I've watched enough things to know that real things eventually find their footing. I sat with that for a moment. Real things eventually find their footing. I repeated. That's basically the whole story, isn't it? He said. Kind of is, I said. Alaric organized a team dinner in late June to mark the close of our biggest contract to date. A supply chain company expanding operations across 3 states, multi-phase engagement, significant scope, a partnership that would continue into the following year. By every metric, the kind of deal that put us in a different conversation. We went to a restaurant in Dumbo with brick walls and a wine list that required actual consideration. The whole team was there. Lockwood and Alaric and the 2 newer people who'd come up fast and were already essential. Merrick, because Merrick always comes. We ordered too much food. The conversation moved through the work and then away from the work and into the easy, wide-ranging kind of talking that happens when people have been through something real together and can afford, briefly, to just be in the room without an agenda. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, after the 2nd bottle and the easy laughter of a group who know each other past the professional layer, I looked around the table. Just for a moment. A quiet beat in the middle of the noise. I was exactly where the work had been pointing. I couldn't have described what I felt as triumph. It wasn't loud enough for that word. It was more like the particular rightness of a thing that has finally arrived at the shape it was always moving toward. Some people hear this story and want to call it a revenge arc. I've noticed that shape being applied to it in the retelling. She left, he succeeded, she regretted it, justice was served. The clean, satisfying version. But that frame gets something wrong. Revenge implies the success was for her. That what I built was a response to what she said when she left. It wasn't. The work existed before her. The work existed during her. The work existed after her. She was never the reason for the work. She was someone who decided, for a season, that the work wasn't interesting enough. And then the work became interesting. And the thing she chose instead of the work turned out to be a federal investigation. I didn't plan that. I didn't wait for it. I just didn't stop. Merrick and I were having drinks at a place in the West Village on a Saturday evening in July. One of those no-agenda evenings we do periodically, good food and no schedule. He asked me, somewhere in the 2nd hour, whether I was thinking about dating again. Genuinely asking. Not as a setup. I said, probably. Eventually. He asked what I was looking for. I thought about it for longer than I expected to. There was a longer answer forming under the shorter one. Someone who shows up for the slow part, I said. He looked at me. Explain, he said. Someone who can sit with the foundation phase, I said. When there's not much visible from the outside. When the thing you're building is real but doesn't look like much yet. When the work hasn't gotten loud. Someone who sees it anyway. Not because they're being patient or tolerant of it, but because they actually understand what a foundation is. He was quiet. That's a high bar, he said finally. I know. Worth waiting for, he said. Yeah, I said. We drank. The city moved outside the window. Someone at the table beside us said something, and the whole group laughed. Warm and unself-conscious and fully human. I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. I felt like someone who had arrived somewhere by taking the long route and didn't regret the distance. She called the silence between us growing in different directions. I called it foundation work. We were describing the same months, the same Tuesday mornings, the same slow accumulation of unglamorous, non-trending effort. We just understood what that time was for entirely differently. And that difference, between seeing foundation work as limitation and seeing it as the most necessary part of the whole structure, turned out to be the most important thing I could have learned about both of us. Because foundations determine everything that can be built on top of them. And what gets built on a real one lasts. And what gets built on a fabricated one gets deleted. Quietly. Without explanation. Just a gap in the timeline where something used to be. And somewhere 2 miles east, a company with real clients and a real track record and a signed lease on a real office is doing exactly what it was always doing. Showing up. Building. One quiet, unglamorous, non-trending day at a time. The work never needed a caption. It just needed time. And in New York, time is the one thing no one ever thinks they have until they look up and realize it was there the whole time, accumulating quietly in the background while everyone else was busy posting about potential.